Ukraine has imposed sanctions on the creators of Masha and the Bear cartoon. You probably heard about it, especially if you have kids. It's an enormously popular Russian cartoon about a mischievous little girl and a very patient bear. I would say this girl is actually a real brat. And I have to start with a confession. My son used to watch this cartoon all the time when he was 3 or 4. I didn't have a problem with it at all. In fact, he watched it so much that I still remember some of the songs by heart. I wouldn't say I was a big fan of that cartoon, but at the time, I saw exactly what millions of parents around the world saw, a funny children's cartoon. I don't remember noticing military or Soviet imagery in the episodes he watched, and more importantly, this was before Russia annexed Crimea, before the full scale invasion of Ukraine. I simply didn't look at Russian children's entertainment as something that could potentially be a threat. Today, I see it differently. And I think living in Ukraine for several years gave me a very different perspective on how Russian culture, Russian symbols, and Russian narratives can work outside Russia. So, why would Ukraine consider a cartoon about a little girl and a bear a national security issue? There are several answers. First, the money. On August 20th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky imposed sanctions on 5 Russian citizens and 4 organizations connected to the creation and distribution of Masha and the Bear, including the Animacord studio. Ukraine says the people behind the cartoon continue to contribute money to the Russian budget. And it's not just a small thing. Masha and the Bear is one of Russia's most successful cultural exports. It has been watched tens of billions of times on YouTube and distributed around the world. I will tell you more. It remained enormously popular in Ukraine even during the war. According to Ukrainian reporting, in 2025, the Ukrainian language Masha and the Bear YouTube channel received more than 800 million views. So, a country is fighting a war against Russia while Ukrainian children are generating hundreds of millions of views for a Russian owned entertainment product. Some Ukrainian estimates put the revenue generated from Ukrainian viewers at around almost $2.5 million. So, from Kyiv's perspective, this isn't simply about whether children should hear Russian or watch a Russian cartoon. It's an economic question. Should Ukrainians be generating revenue for a Russian company while Russia is waging war against Ukraine? But money is only one part of the story. The second argument is about soft power. Soft power is the ability of a country to influence people not through tanks, laws, or coercion, but through culture, like, jazz programs on Voice of America during the Soviet era. Masha and the Bear is good soft power precisely because it doesn't look political. Masha doesn't give speeches about Putin. Well, not yet, I would say. The Bear doesn't explain Russian foreign policy. It's cute, funny, and familiar. And that's exactly the point. The cartoon creates a warm, friendly cultural universe that is unmistakably Russian. However, there are some much more explicit images. In one episode, for example, Masha plays a Soviet-style border guard. She wears a military-style cap with a red star. Other episodes have attracted criticism for Soviet military imagery and uniforms associated with Soviet security structures. For many viewers outside the former Soviet Union, that might look like nothing more than a funny costume. But Ukrainians, and not only them, have a very different historical relationship with those symbols. The NKVD wasn't simply an organization with funny old-fashioned hats. It was one of the Soviet institutions responsible for political repression, deportations, and suppression of resistance to Soviet rule. A Soviet Red Star in a children's cartoon looks very different when your country is being invaded by an army that constantly invokes Soviet history and Soviet symbols. By the way, Ukraine is not the only country having this conversation. In July, more than 50 British members of parliament from several political parties raised concerns about Masha and the Bear. They specifically pointed to Soviet military imagery and asked whether the program could function as a vehicle for Russian soft power. The British government didn't ban the cartoon, though, but the fact that this discussion is happening in Britain is important because it means this isn't simply Ukraine saying everything Russian is dangerous. But while this debate was growing, Netflix acquired rights to additional seasons of Masha and the Bear for audiences in more than 100 countries. So, one of Russia's most successful cultural products continues expanding internationally, even while governments are trying to reduce Russian influence in other areas. So, is Masha secretly working for Putin? Well, of course not, and we should be careful with statements like that. Animacord company strongly rejects that accusation. The company says it's independent, receives no Russian government funding, and that the cartoon has no political agenda. And to be honest, I doubt that somebody in the Kremlin, sits down and approves every Masha episode, because soft power doesn't necessarily require direct government control. A cartoon can be genuinely entertaining, commercially successful, and loved by children, and at the same time contribute to a positive cultural image of the country that produced it. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. And this is probably where my own perspective changed the most. Years ago, when my son was watching Masha, I would probably have laughed at the idea that this little girl and her bear represented some kind of geopolitical threat. Then I lived in Ukraine. I watched Russia annex Crimea. I watched the hybrid war in Donbass. And I began to understand something that Ukrainians had been arguing for years. Russian influence doesn't begin when the tanks cross the border. For decades, Ukraine existed inside a huge Russian cultural and information space. Russian television, Russian books, Russian music, Russian celebrities, Russian children's entertainment. Most of it didn't look political. And much of it probably wasn't created with any political purpose at all, but it still helped create a world in which Russia was culturally central and Ukraine was peripheral. So the question is, when a country is fighting for its survival, where does it draw the line between culture and influence? Ukraine has now drawn that line around one of the world's most famous cartoon characters. And I understand that decision much better than I would have when my son was sitting in front of the television watching Masha and I was singing those songs along with him.